And many people have described the pending state bills and the ones that have already been passed as, like you said, targeting suppression of votes of minorities and are reminiscent of the Jim Crow era. Do you think that's an accurate description to categorize this as reminiscent of the Jim Crow era? People are calling it Jim Crow 2.0.
Yeah, I think we're seeing the largest rollback of voting rights since Jim Crow. Um, the fact is that from 1965 to 2009, states on average made their voting laws easier. In 2009, Barack Obama took the White House. You saw Shelby County in 2013. You saw some states roll back voting rights in the wake of Shelby County, most notably North Carolina, where they passed a bill that looks like what we're seeing today. That was struck down after the Fourth Circuit found that it targeted African Americans with surgical precision. But we've not seen the kind of breadth of states, looking to roll back voting rights as extremely as they are now since Jim Crow.
So let's focus a little bit on the Georgia law because that has been in the news a lot recently, and it's widely denounced. President Biden said it is Jim Crow in the 21st century, and he's even now considering taking action to change the rules of filibuster to protect voters and to pass H.R. 1, which is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. You have been fighting for fair elections and for voting rights basically your entire legal career. And so I want to talk more about the Georgia bill. And one of the things I wanted to focus on is some of the remarks that have been made to justify passing that law. Obviously, this is done by Republicans in Georgia. Governor Kemp claimed the bill makes it easier to vote and harder to cheat, and it would restore confidence in elections, even though, of course, there is no evidence that there was anything unsafe or fraudulent about the last election. And so I'd love to hear, your response to what is the best argument that Republicans have made for any of the restrictions they put on. And then we can talk about how you're going to answer them because we know you've gone to court. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. So, look, I think to understand why the Republicans are making the arguments they are, you have to look back to the period of November 2020 to January 6th, 2021. So, the argument that you laid out is more or less the argument they make, which is that they need to restore confidence. The whole easier to vote, harder to cheat is nonsensical. First of all, they are not making it easier to vote, and the governor himself, along with the Republican Secretary of State, said that there was no cheating. So I think that the argument they're really making, that you hear them articulate to put their best foot forward, is that they are trying to restore confidence. But of course, you have to ask yourself, why is there a lack of confidence? Right? There wasn't a lack of confidence until Donald Trump started to badmouth the elections, and until Republican state legislators, members of Congress, leadership humored him at first, and then joined him in the big lie. And so, I don't know who said this, but someone wrote on Twitter that there really isn't a midpoint between the fireman and the arsonist, right? You can't treat the argument that we somehow need to restore confidence as a serious argument when the reason why there is some lack of confidence is intentional on the part of the people who are now trying to make it harder to vote.
Absolutely. And I think everything that I have heard is, as you said, it just is nonsensical, saying we're making it easier, when in fact, if we look at the specific elements of what was passed, my initial impression was first, it was only a couple of pages, and the one that actually passed was 90 some pages, and included some really creative ways to prevent voting and to hurt a minority community. But it seemed to me that now that I've looked at some of the things that were in the first one, it actually was even worse, because it would have, for example, barred Sunday voting, which has traditionally been a day that Black churches take voters to the polls. And so eliminating that, And as you were mentioning, when you cut off the end of the day, it's because there are a lot of people who work 9 to 5, but have to travel several hours to get to their job, which means they cannot vote at 7 in the morning and they can't vote at 5 o'clock at night. And so then the polls are closed.
Right.
So can you address those concerns and whether the first bill was actually worse?
So it's really interesting, Joe, because I think what you've seen, and I think this is a pattern that we're going to see, is that the first round of bills that are being introduced are by the crazies, right? The message bills. They're kind of like putting out the let's repeal all vote by mail. Let's, they put out the stuff that is just like out there, out there, out there, as part of a messaging effort um, to their base.
Hmm.
Then I think what happened in Georgia, and obviously they don't consult me, and I think what happened in Iowa, where they also passed an omnibus bill, is that leadership thinks, okay, we'll be able to rein this back in. I mean? We'll let the people put out their message bills. You know how the legislative process works. You put out the message bills, and then that sort of takes the energy out of it. The problem is that they weren't able to take they were able to temper the worst aspects of those first bills, but they still had to deliver to their base a bill that was going to revenge, in their words, quotes, January, the election of Joe Biden. And let's not forget, in Georgia, it was also the election of the first Black senator. There's, no coincidence, in my view, that we see this bill coming in Georgia in the way it did on the heels of Reverend Warnock's election.
Well, and taking both seats, 2 Democrats winning Senate seats in runoffs had to have been a motivating factor. The Republicans did hold hearings, but as you just mentioned, they didn't call you to testify. They called Rudy Giuliani. And, when I look at that, that says all that I need to know. They weren't serious about looking at, was there a problem that needed fixing, or was it just a ridiculous thing? One other thing that Republicans in Georgia said is, there's no suppression in this bill. It's just helping out because we had such a large election. We had to control this in some way. Show me the suppression, a representative named Alan Powell said. So I would like to ask you to talk about the things that are suppressive and some that might not seem directly suppressive, but like taking away Raffensperger's, the Secretary of State's powers, and even the powers of local election boards, which aren't necessarily targeting the voter, but end up counting against how things are counted.
Yeah, so that's such a good and important point, and such a good and important question, because I think in the public's mind sometimes, and I bet you're going to tell me this is true across all areas of the law, the public wants the smoking gun, right? They want that one thing, right? They want that one provision that says, aha, here is the provision that says, they want the provision entitled Voter Suppression Act of 2021. When in fact, laws are more complicated than that. They are comprised of a large number of provisions that all, what I say, is cut the same way. And when you stack them up, they have a cumulative effect that any one of them might not in and of itself be. So
Mhm.
I mentioned, one of the things people talk about all the time is voter ID laws. And they say, yeah, but what's wrong with voter ID laws? And I always say, look, setting aside for a second the direct disenfranchisement of voter ID laws, when you ask, when you add a step to the check-in process in a state, you are going to slow down voting.
Mm.
Like, you may just slow down voting by 10 or 15 seconds. But if you slow down voting by 10 or 15 seconds per person, and you have also had other problems with long lines, you're going to create, you're going to exacerbate that. But in Georgia, you mentioned the taking away of the authority of the ability of the election board, now the composition of it, to be controlled more closely by the legislature. That is a form of voter suppression that could trump all others, to use a bad word. because it potentially
No pun
gives,
intended.
no pun intended, because it allows state legislatures that frankly showed irresponsible behavior in many instances at the end of 2020 to be able to act more directly on those irresponsible impulses. So this was a bad bill. This is a bill that is targeted at Black voters, other minority voters, and young voters. And it's also, as you point out, an anti-democracy bill.
Yeah. Well, you've mentioned the voter ID requirements being increased and that making the lines even longer by just even 15 seconds per voter limitation. But when you add to that you've cut down the early voting period,
Right.
you have eliminated a lot of the vote by mail. You've restricted where there are drop boxes and the times. You can only drop off during a time when the place of voting is opened, which means it's during the time people are working. So when you combine all of those, you have to say that that is more suppressive.
Right.
Did any
And,
Democrats vote for it?
and just to pick up on that for a second. So
Mhm.
let's go back to my premise. African Americans wait online 51 minutes, whites wait online 6 minutes. Now, you've just decreased early voting. What have you done? Well, you've pushed some number of people into voting election day, right? You've decreased the size of the number or the
Mhm.
breadth of opportunities to vote. So you're gonna increase lines. You mentioned fewer drop boxes. So some people are not going to trust the mail because they distrust the mail for understandable reasons. So what's that going to do? That's going to increase in-person voting and increase lines. So this is what I mean about the interplay of these things. It's
Right.
not any one of these individually. It is the fact that when you cut days of early voting and you make absentee ballot applications harder to get, you're going to have an exponential, a multiplier effect between and among these provisions.
So were there any Democrats who voted for this?
No.
No, not a surprise. Okay.
Yeah.
So Stacey Abrams had tweeted just before the bill passed that she predicted that it was going to pass fast in order to avoid actual analysis and public awareness of how it hurts voters of color, increases taxes on struggling families, and steals power from local governments. And you replied, you promised an immediate lawsuit, which you have lived up to your promise. So, can you tell us a little bit more about that in Georgia and what your plans are in other states that are still having these pending, Arizona and several other states?
Yeah. So you're right about the Georgia speed. I mean, Georgia, after days and days and weeks of deliberation, they decided on a single day that it had to pass the House, the Senate, and be signed by the governor. So within a matter of a few hours, the whole bill took shape and was signed with the governor under the picture of a plantation. All of that in one day. That press conference in which he signed it was about 6:30. We filed our lawsuit in federal court by 10:30 that evening.
Wow.
In Iowa, when they had passed their law, the governor signed it at about 8 p.m. at night. We filed a lawsuit the following morning at 8 a.m. So what I've said publicly and promised to these vote suppressors who pass these laws, if you pass these laws, you will be sued, and you will be sued fast. And we will aggressively litigate to protect the rights of voters. So in Georgia, we represent the New Georgia Project, an African American voter registration organization. We represent Black Voters Matter, and we represent RISE, which is a student group.
Hmm.
And our claims are that the law violates Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in that it discriminates against Black voters, and also violations of the U.S. Constitution, the right to vote, because these provisions are not justified by any state interest and pose a severe burden on voters.